Thank you for being here and not in the bar waiting for the game. I thought the kicking off was a perfect way of saying this. So first of all, let me just say about this title. They said, would you like to speak? And I said, yeah, okay, sure. Could you make the title a little controversial? And I said, how about this, right? And they said, okay, great. So don't be depressed before I say anything. And the thing is, here I'm operating as an analyst. Some of you I've met. I was with IBM, as someone termed it, for half of the computer age. I've been with vendors. But here I'm trying to give a little bit more balanced view. And in fact, for a lot of this, I'm just showing you some things for you to make your own decisions about. Right? And so the first part of this, in fact, probably 2/3 of it, are a bunch of numbers and things like this. But the charts are very pretty, I will say. So this I just want to start with, and I show this slide almost every time I talk about this notion of practical quantum advantage. And it's the idea of, look, can we get to a point where quantum computers plus classical computers, right? Computing is an integrated process. Can they do significantly better than classical systems alone? This is not quantum supremacy, third generation, right? Back of the room experiments. This is like, we really care about these problems. They could be commercial, they could be societal, whatever they may happen to be. And it's this word that's practical, right? Really practical, and when we're going to get there. And in fact, that's the problem, right? Because getting to that point, a lot of times with quantum, it always seems to be just slipping slightly further away as we get to it. Because, in fact, as we build these systems, the systems are more complicated, we're discovering more things, but there are bona fide breakthroughs that happen. Either long-standing problems, and certainly Google showed something with that on Monday, but you know, as people go along, they figure out different ways of doing things. They thought they'd do it this way, and they do it another way. I sometimes give a talk with an analogy to the Apollo program, which I'm not going to talk about, except that at some point they considered that the way to land on the moon was to have a very tall rocket, right? And it would go up, and it would go to the moon, and then it would land on its tail fins coming down like this, sort of like the old science fiction ones where you built a rocket in your backyard, right? You know, went to the moon, looked around, until they sort of said, well, you know, maybe landing like this, the rocket might fall over. Now, that was a perfectly fine idea for a couple of years, a very seriously considered idea. And of course, later engineering changed the way they happen to do that. So we get smarter, and more people enter into this. And that's why it's so important to have so many different types of people in different parts of the world from different areas of expertise who can look at the problem. So the first thing I want to look at is, where are we today? And so I'd say an interesting fundamental question is, how many quantum computing qubit companies, QPU companies, are there? So these are the people, just to be clear, they don't make cables, right? They don't make this little piece of photonic apparatus that somebody else puts in their systems. They somehow make qubits. And they stand up and they say, we are a quantum computing company, right? And then, depending on who they are, there's half a web page, or it goes on forever, and they've been involved. So, and in fact, I was curious about this number, and if you go out, you can look at different lists, right, that people have done through the years. And one of the problems is, you know, you say, oh, that's an interesting company, I haven't heard of them, and you click on the link, and it goes like nowhere. There's no web page, which means this company isn't around anymore. And it's very difficult sometimes. You may have to wait till their web hosting contract expires to actually know that they're not there anymore. Others are much more public about this. So how many of such companies are there? Is there 2 dozen? Is it 100? Is it 200? Certainly less than a septillion, I will give you that. Okay, that may be too soon. But here's a chart of showing you how many companies there are by country, just to start with the geographic distribution. Right? And here there are 67 companies, and I'll tell you a story about this number. I had to make these slides last week, by the way, just to submit them, so they've been frozen since last Thursday. Total number of companies equals 67. That was great. On Monday, one of them announced that they were out of business. So my number dropped. And then, lo and behold, I found one more. Turned out, and they're both the same modality, so it makes things a little bit equal. So I'm sorry, Norway, you actually really go off the current version of the slide. Your one is gone. They're out of the business, the Nordic Quantum Computing Group. But the UK, congratulations, you have one more. Right? So this number is, don't think of it as an exact number. Maybe think of it as plus or minus 3 or 4, something like that, with around the borders, they're coming and they're going. And sometimes there are like 2 professors, an MBA, son-in-law, and a dog and a cat, right? But that's life. That's startups and things like this. Well, we can also break this down by region. So here are, on the left, 4 of the standard simple ways: North America, EMEA, Latin America, I'm sorry, APAC, EMEA, Latin America, and North America. And no qubit makers in Latin America at this point. If you look at EMEA, and of course EMEA is really, it's too big a region, really, to just talk about, right? I mean, you've got 2 continents, and plus part of another one, right? And things like this. But you can kind of at least see, right, the top 2 over there. And if we want to be technical and you want to go through the list and take Brexit into account and a few of the European companies that are not in the EU, here's that other number. That is, strictly speaking, are you formally a member of the EU, right? And so it drops down to about 19. So, I certainly wish Latin America was higher, but that's not an unreasonable distribution. And what kinds of quantum computing are these companies doing, these 67? By far, the digital approach, the gate and circuit approach, what I talk about in my book, most books talk about that, is the dominant. So 53 out of 67. Starting next year, some companies say they may be in both the analog bar as well as the digital bar, but we will wait and see. They actually have to demonstrate it and fully. And there is one annealing company, right? And you can interpret that, right, in terms of which seem to be the popular approaches here. So, all right, that gives you an indication. And by the way, analog, a lot of the photonic computers, the continuous variable types of systems are analog computers. And anyway, so that's interesting. Now, what about modalities? And this is always, I think, an interesting question. You hear about superconducting. The other day, John Preskill started breaking it down. You've got fluxions, right? And what flowerons? That's one of them. Different flavors of this. You've got the dual rail. You've got basically different ways of doing this. And the trapped ions and things like this. And to me, there was a really kind of a big surprise in this chart as to who is number 2, right? So superconducting, yeah, that's reasonable. It's IBM, it's Google, Alice and Bob, Nord Quantique, and you can go on and on like that. I expected that to be number 1. I didn't expect silicon spin to have such a strong showing. And silicon spin, I think, the way I would advise them is to talk about yourself as a 2nd generation quantum modality. The research has gone on for a long time, but it's now being pulled to the forefront so that people are talking about it. They don't have massive numbers of qubits yet, but there's been very good momentum over the last 2 or 3 years, right? And that's one of the problems that such slides don't show, is they appear fairly static. And I think the momentum, if I could possibly go back and really, because I don't have those numbers, of showing how these numbers had changed over time, right? I'm sure Global Quantum Intelligence has such numbers. You would kind of see the balance there. And so, okay, right? That's interesting, silicon spin. You probably need fabs for the first 2. Trapped ions, yeah, we've very high, we've heard of those, the Quantinuum, IonQ. None of these, by the way, are just university efforts. These are all official companies. So if I were to go out and look at what universities were doing what, and there are many times the number of companies doing this, certain of these would be much higher. So for example, the neutral atoms would be much higher, because you can largely buy off the shelf, assuming you can get a laser delivered to you, all the pieces you need. to make one of those. And so you can have a grant. It's still expensive, but you can find the parts, right? You don't need a fab there. And so you kind of look at this, and it really does break down to the top 5 and the bottom 5, just numerically. And bringing up the bottom of the top 5 is neutral atoms, right? Often cesium and rubidium. Companies like Inflection and QEra, Pascal, so forth, like this. And you might say, well, okay, you know, again, everyone's always looking at who's winning and things like this. But when you look at these other types of relationships, right? Google, evidently, we are told, yes, I see you all, that they have invested quite a lot of money in you to do something. So Google's superconducting, obviously, Willow and whatever, is now going to evidently be working closely with QEra. IBM, superconducting, Pascal, neutral atoms. Microsoft, topological, first with Quantinuum, great results, logical qubits. Now moving forward with atom computing, who have more qubits, more potential qubits here, but also neutral atoms. And I would go back to yesterday as well. You have Inflection and NVIDIA on the same stage talking about what they did with Q2Q to create logical qubits. Now, I do know NVIDIA works with a lot of people, but we're on stage talking about this result, and the blog entry was in the NVIDIA corporate blog, not buried in some sort of developer blog. So NVIDIA was highlighting this. So maybe it's not a whole lot of dollars, but nevertheless, you're starting to see very large companies aligning, and what modality are they aligning with, right? Again, this moves. Now, if you want to look at modalities here, we can break it down by countries. Again, sorry, Norway, you come out of photonic, but UK bumps up to 2. And again, you know, superconducting is winning. It's a fairly even distribution, right? You know, within error bars. Really, this number of the USA seems to love superconducting. At 40% of all the superconducting companies are American. So it's spread. I wouldn't conclude too much about this. But there are 17 countries, right? Now, there are slightly less than 200 countries in the world. So in that regard, 17 out of, it's about 194. You get into trouble when you start trying to give an exact number at the top. So still not really well represented, totally worldwide. But you can see what's happening. You can also ask yourself about what are the sovereign programs. You know, where's the money being put? How easy is it to get workers, IP and things? And if you want to do the research on what just happened with Norway, that lays out a lot of it in great details. So I think this kind of gives you a flavor. But one thing we've got to come back to, look, whether it's 10 modalities, oh, we're so varied in 17 countries, 67 companies is just never going to work. You know, it's just not. You know, I mean, you got NVIDIA, you got Intel, you got AMD, you got a few others, right? It just doesn't work in the long run. Something's going to have to give. And if I were to give this talk in 6 months, the numbers would even be slightly different. And some will go and whatever, and that happens. And you know, with startups in general, 75 to 90% of them fail, and quantum is not special. And it's deep tech, which requires hardware and long-term investment. It takes longer, so you often get out of the ROI windows for investors. So things will change, but at least there's a lot of variety. That's the positive part now. Now, I do like it when people publish roadmaps. It does give investors, potential customers, an idea of what's coming. I was part of the initial effort with IBM when we did the roadmap several years ago, and they have since matured that greatly. The latest one was Alice and Bob. A beautiful effort, by the way. It's incredibly attractive. It's a great story. It's funny. And I point other people to say, yeah, do one of these. It's very nice, right? And it lays out what you're doing. Now we have to get underneath it and say what you're really doing and what you're really saying. Some of these roadmaps, The ones that I put as low maybe might not even qualify as roadmaps. They're kind of like, yeah, we're going to do this, and this someday, maybe, somehow, right? But I try to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. And there are 2 slides worth here, and it's just listed alphabetically, right? I do think, again, IBM was first. There are others that are starting to give them a run for their money in terms of details and what to expect when. It's a good idea. It's a little risky because what if you don't hit the different milestones on them? One of the great things, though, is that this industry and the media industry totally forgets and never goes back and checks, right? If you were to look now at what was supposed to be delivered by the end of 2024 by some of these companies, you would be really surprised, right? But things happen, and it's okay, and say, hey, we're taking this different direction. We have a smarter idea. But this is good. You know, I mean, if you're going to be in the top, you have to tell people that you have confidence in how you're going to get eventually to something which is truly useful. So are we languishing? So bad news, good news, right, as we finish up here. We are not scaling the number of high-quality qubits enough. And how many physical qubits do we need? If you're a vendor, it's a really low number. If you're a user, if you're in pharmaceuticals, it's a really high number, like more than 3 million, right? So I'm just going to say 100,000 physical qubits because it's a little bit bigger, it's a little bit out of reach. It shows we're on the path to scaling, right, somehow. We've got to do quantum networking. We are going to make big quantum computers out of little quantum computers, QPUs. We're only seeing 3 or 4 companies do this right now. Some of the superconducting ones, like IBM and Rigetti, it's a little bit easier with microwaves. Others that are more optically or photonically active can do it in other ways. So New Quantum is doing some of this. WeLink in France is doing this, and so forth. With these 67, there's just so much reinvention of the wheel with minor things, minor changes. It's not enough to say, oh, we're very happy with a small number of great qubits. That's you know, well, good, but now make 100,000, right? And so this is the toy metaphor that they're trying to do. And then sovereign interests, some countries will just drive. They have to have their own national quantum computer. And this is forcing why there's some of this duplication of effort. This is completely reasonable, but it's a geopolitical concern. Are we languishing? No, because in fact, you're seeing some really nice work, right? People are understanding errors all the way from suppression to mitigation. We're trying to understand some things with better codes of what people are doing. They're not actually probably going to be using the surface code, right? I mean, we now have a result from Google, but that's probably not what we're going to do. Error correction is going to get more sophisticated, more heterogeneous, right? And how we approach this, even within a single QPU, right? It's not one single block of qubits and we're doing one thing to it, right? And that's it. There's a complexity, there's a depth to this. And the machine learning is playing a bigger role in improving the performance of quantum computers. This is AI for quantum, right? Personally, quantum for AI, nice research project. This is the value, this has to be the concentration right now. This is going to speed us up to getting quantum advantage. So to finish, all right, well, how do we reduce the number of QPU companies? We can let some of them go out of business. Maybe they'll merge. You can imagine the discussions, 2 CEOs. Yeah, let's join our companies. I'll be in charge, right? Or the investors, so it's a problem. You have to increase the investment in implementation of this QPU to QPU networking. If you're a vendor, pick a small enough number, 20 qubits. Get there, make them good, now start connecting them. It's a 2-track program starting next year. You cannot wait 6 years to get your modality to 100 qubits. You cannot. You will be so far behind. Maybe you live that long, but then you're out because you've been lapped. Focus more on the software side for hardware control. We see some companies that are part of this. Next year, if I give a similar talk, it would be much more about software, about what we're doing. But I want to start at the lowest level. I don't think, really, we're going to see a whole lot happening in this NISQ era until we get logical qubits at scale. And I think if you were to go forward 15 years, they'd say, oh, that was an area of great intellectual interest. And we don't do it like that anymore at all, right? So be careful about that. Be careful if you're pursuing a PhD in that, right? And then finally, own up to it. So my final word is here, be optimistic. We're not totally languishing, but be realistic about this. And that's when I say stop making excuses and stop the hype. Thank you.